The author, may Allah have mercy upon him, said, the conditions of purification. The conditions of an act, as already mentioned, are not parts of the act, but are needed for the act to be valid. We defined this previously. Therefore, it is usual for the conditions of any particular case to be mentioned before its actual integrals, as a signal to the need to fulfill the conditions before the integrals. Remember, the integrals of the act are the parts of the act itself. The conditions of an act have to be fulfilled before the integrals of the act are fulfilled. So usually they'll mention the conditions before they mention the integrals. Why then did the Shaykh, may Allah have mercy on him, mention the integrals of wudu and ghusl before their conditions? We already talked about the integrals of wudu, we talked about the integrals of ghusl, and now we're coming to talk about the conditions of wudu and ghusl. Perhaps he delayed mentioning the conditions for one's purification to be valid until after discussing the actual wudu and ghusl because of the urgency of one knowing how to perform them so that one can pray on time correctly. Besides, is it not normal that the one performing the ghusl or wudu would be a sane Muslim making water flow over his organs, etc., even if he did not realize that those are conditions? Yes, it is normal. Nevertheless, it is important to know these conditions, i.e., for them to be listed and specified so that a person can approach his worship well-rounded with proper background knowledge. The translators counted 5 conditions and then left the remainder of what the Shaykh said uncounted. They counted 5 conditions, and the rest of what the Shaykh said, they didn't count it, unless they considered it all part of the 5th condition. If you have a copy of the Summary of Obligatory Knowledge, you look at the conditions of purification, see 5 conditions there, and then there's more talk after that. So what's the case of that talk afterwards? Are they uncounted? Or are they all considered as part of the 5th condition? The translators counted 5 conditions and then left the remainder of what the Shaykh said uncounted, unless they considered it all part of the 5th condition. However, it is possible to count the rest as 2 or 3 more conditions, as will be done here. Thus, among the conditions of purification are: 1. For the person performing the wudu and the ghusl and even the tayammum to be a Muslim. This is because these are acts of worship, and the acts of worship need an intention, and the intention is not valid from the blasphemer. The exception in this case is the ghusl of the Muslim's Christian or Jewish wife whose menstruation or postpartum bleeding has ended. In this case, he cannot have intercourse with her until she does what appears to be a ghusl, with all of its conditions, except the intention. The intention, which is an integral technically. The Shaykh did not mean that her ghusl is a valid act of worship when he said in his Bughya that her ghusl is valid. Rather, he means that it is recognized and that Muslim husband is now permitted to have sexual intercourse with her. As a worship, it is not valid. This is why if she embraces Islam, she must repeat the ghusl with a valid intention, because it wasn't a valid worship. And although her intention is not valid as long as she's a kafir, or kafirah, as long as she's a kafirah, this is still counted as an act of purification because it falls under what is done like an act of purification. As for the removal of filth, It is an act of purification, but it does not require an intention, as mentioned in the chapter of istinja. So we talked about that already. Therefore, the person removing the filth does not have to be a Muslim. Also, the ghusl for the dead Muslim does not require an intention. So if a kafir gave that dead Muslim a ghusl, it's valid. 2. The second is for the person to be at the age of mental discrimination, i.e., mental discerning, telling the difference. It would have been better to merely say, to have mental discrimination. So remember, what's in red is what is in the published translation of the Mukhtasar. So they said to be at the age of mental discrimination. It would have been better to merely say to have mental discrimination. And that is what the Sheikh says in the Arabic text. He says at-tamyiz, having mental discrimination. This is because a person may be at the normal age of mental discerning, but not have it, such as an insane adult. Thus, it is not the age that is the condition. It is the actual power to mentally discern, regardless of the age. And that is what the translators meant. May Allah reward them for benefiting us. So anytime the translation is criticized in some way here, it's not with any malicious intent. Those are our sheikhs who benefited us greatly, and they have a big favor over us. MashaAllah. But it was normal for when the scholars would comment on the books of others that they just point out what was right, what was wrong, what was done well, what was not done as well as it could be. That's all. It's nothing more than that, just so that we benefit. They probably translated the condition as the age of mental discrimination, because usually those who lack this power to discern are the small children. Therefore, if a person reached this ability before the normal age of its onset, which is 7 lunar years as already mentioned, his purification can be valid. Once a person reaches mental discerning, even if he was 4 years old or 5 years old, once he reaches that ability, he can do worships validly. So it's not the age itself that makes it valid, it's the power to discern. If he did not reach it by the age at which it normally occurs, 7 lunar years, his performing purification is not valid until he reaches it, even if he became an adult with this disability. Yani, even if he's an adult who lacks mental discrimination, which means he's insane, it is not valid for him to make wudu by himself or make a ghusl by himself. Know, however, that what is precisely intended by this condition is the ability of one personally engaging in the purification. But in the case of circling the Kaaba, it is valid for the guardian of a child or an insane person to make the intention on behalf of his ward. His ward means the person that he's in charge of. In the case of circling the Kaaba, it is valid for the guardian of a child, meaning the child who hasn't reached mental discrimination, or an insane person to make the intention on behalf of his ward and to perform the purification on his organs and then take him around the Kaaba. This purification is valid, and that ward is granted reward by the generosity of the Lord, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So that's a typo there. The third is to remove, i.e., the lack of anything that prevents the validity of purification, whether it was a religious prevention or a physical barrier. As for the religious prevention, that is like for a woman to be menstruating. The ceasing of the bleeding is necessary for her to perform a valid wudu or ghusl, because the menstrual bleeding defies purification. However, it is recommended for a woman who wants to enter the state of ihram to perform a ghusl, and if she is actively menstruating, she does what appears to be a ghusl. Similar to that is if someone were making wudu while holding his penis. His wudu would not be valid because such an action defies the wudu in the first place. So that's a religious prevention. One of the conditions for the validity of the purification is the lack of anything that prevents purification, whether it's a religious prevention or a physical barrier. A physical prevention is like a barrier that blocks the water from reaching the part to be washed, if it is a washed organ, or the part to be wiped, which refers to the head and the khufs in wudu, and the likes of a cast in wudu or ghusl. Therefore, one should remove fat or grease, like shortening, that is stuck to the skin if it blocks the water, and nail polish since it blocks the water from the nail. Also, it is not permissible to wear nail polish. One should also remove any dirt from beneath the nails if that blocks the water. And that was said to be overlooked. It was said that the dirt under the nails is overlooked. So you have two sayings. One saying is that if it blocks the water from reaching, you have to remove it. Another saying is that it's overlooked. What blocks the color of the skin, but does not prevent the water from reaching the skin itself, does not have to be removed, like ink. As for the tattoo, it will be mentioned in the 9th chapter pertaining to filth, God willing. So when we say ink doesn't have to be removed, we're not talking about the tattoo. We'll come back, inshallah, to talk about the tattoo. Any question thus far? Can you expand on the fat or grease on the area to be washed? Simply it is, if that's a material that blocks the water from getting through, if the water can't penetrate it to get to the skin, then it has to be removed. The grease, for example, if it's like oil and water don't mix. So the oil, if it's grease like oil, then it's possible that it makes a water-resistant barrier over the skin. So if that's the case, it needs to be removed. You said, I heard that olive oil is allowed to have in your hair during wudu. Yes, as long as it doesn't block the water from reaching. A simple layer like what people usually do will not block the water from reaching the skin. In fact, the skin will have absorbed that. The skin and the hair will have absorbed that oil. It's not going to block the water. But if you put enough, if you apply enough of it, it will block the water. Okay, the author said, digression. Know that as a rule, it is not valid to wipe over something that covers something that should be wiped, instead of wiping that part that is supposed to be wiped itself. This digression came under the talk about a barrier or a prevention. So here's a rule, might be helpful for you sometime. It is not valid to wipe over something that covers something that should be wiped. To wipe over something that covers something that should be wiped, instead of wiping that part that is supposed to be wiped itself. For example, it is not valid to treat the turban on the head like khufs and then wipe over it instead of wiping over the head. Because as a rule, you cannot wipe over something that covers something that should be wiped. The head in wudu is wiped. So if you put something over that wiped area, that area that's supposed to be wiped, and then you wipe over that cover instead, that's not valid. So it is not valid to wipe over something that covers something that should be wiped. Take that as a general rule. Instead of wiping that part that is supposed to be wiped itself. For example, it is not valid to treat the turban like hoofs and then wipe over it instead of wiping over the head. It is, however, valid to wipe over the forelock, that means the hair that's right over your forehead, and then to wipe over the turban or its likes after that, if someone wants to perform the sunnah of wiping the entire head without removing his headgear. Meaning, a person doesn't want to take off all his headgear, but he does want to get the reward of wiping the whole head. So what does he do? Just exposes a little bit that some of the forelock that's at the front of your head, right over your forehead. Wipe that, and then wipe over your headgear with the intention of doing the sunnah. Then it's like you wiped your whole head.